Hello and welcome. I'm Rosanna Lockwood and you are watching W News. Live from the Al Arabiya headquarters, these are our top stories. At least 18 people killed in an Israeli airstrike on a school in a refugee camp in Gaza. The US and UK pledged nearly $1.5 billion in additional funding to Ukraine during a rare joint visit to Kyiv. And Capitol Hill will get increased security on January 6 when members of US Congress certify electoral votes for the 2024 presidential election. At least 18 people have been killed by an Israeli strike on a school in the Nuseirat refugee camp in Gaza. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, says 6 of its employees were among those killed in the attack. Israel's military says it took precautions and claims the, quote, precise strike was targeting terrorists. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has condemned the killing, saying Israel's military interventions in Gaza have been unprecedented in his time in the role. Well, for more on this,
in the case of
I'm
Gaza,
now joined from...
Let's be clear, we must condemn firmly what was the horrible terror attacks that Hamas has produced. But then afterwards, we have witnessed a series of military interventions by Israel in Gaza with a level of death and destruction that has no parallel in my time as Secretary General, and with very dramatic violations of international humanitarian law and total absence of an effective protection of civilians. The Hamas also committed several violations of international humanitarian law, and there is the absolutely horrendous question of the hostages. But it is clear that what's happening in Gaza is totally unacceptable.
UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres there. Well, for more on this story, I'm joined from Cairo by UNRWA spokesperson Adnan Abu-Hasna. So thank you for making time. Look, we've heard the official lines about the strike on the school, but tell us in your own words what happened.
Yeah, it is a school that sheltered nearly 12,000 people, of displaced people from all over the Gaza Strip. It's run by UNRWA. We have our team there administrating the shelter. All the coordinates are being sent twice per day to the Israeli army. What happened that many rockets hit the school, and tens of people were killed and injured. Unfortunately, 6 of them, they were UNRWA staff member, among them a head teacher that he used to work as a head teacher, before this war, and now he was administrating the shelter itself. Unfortunately, it's not the first time. It is the 5th time that the school had been targeted, and all the time we are protesting, sending, to the Israelis, asking them not to do it, not to target our installations. But it's about 190 installations that had been hit and destroyed either completely or partly right now.
And I want to come back to those repeat strikes, but first let's start with those who lost their lives. Among the 18, several were colleagues of yours, so sending condolences. Tell us about who they were.
There are 3 of them. They were actually, working, assisting the head of, or the manager of the shelter, who used to work as a head teacher, and others, the shelter did refuge in this shelter. And they are our staff, actually, and some others also were injured, but I don't know the names, or, but I'm sure that some other staff, they were injured, during the strike. And it's unbelievable. Actually, we are panicking there. We don't know. There is no place is safe in Gaza, actually. If you are a UN staff, or you are not a UN staff, or sheltering under the UN flag or not, actually, it's the same now, and everyone exposed to severe danger.
Yeah, your agency head actually saying that this latest strike and those killed brings the total number of UNRWA staff killed in Gaza to 220. How do you keep operating in those conditions?
It's very difficult for us. We are nearly the only organization. We are the lifeline of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. We have 15,000 staff, fixed-term staff still working there, and we have nearly 10,000 of short-term or part-time, staff working, assisting us. All of them, they are panicking. They feel that they could be targeted anytime. It's so difficult to move through the roads and the roads of Gaza. You need a heavy and intensive coordination with the Israeli army. At the end, you might be targeted, anytime. And we never felt like what we're feeling now. Actually, what we feel now, because it's the targets and the shelling and the shooting. It's everywhere, and you could be killed in any moment.
Yeah, we talked about the repeat targeting of this particular site, this school. The Israeli army, you say that you've been trying to coordinate with them. Well, they say, this is their words, that this was a strike targeted at a Hamas, quote, command and control center inside the school. What do you say to that?
No, it's a school, it's sheltering 12,000 people, Actually, we don't have an intelligence capacity to check, people, but we see them as, civilians, and this is the consequences and the result of the attack. That at least 6 of our staff had been killed. So what about others? And this is the first time, actually, that the IDF, targeting the school without any warning. So they can say what they want, but what is the result? What is the result? And the big question now is being asked, it will be like that. If really suppose that there is someone who is, wanted by the Israelis, or they are going after someone, is that justifying the killing of tens of civilians, of 6 of UNRWA staff? As example, we think that they are violating the international law. They are violating, Geneva Convention that, it gives immunity for UN installation and UN staff also, or for civilians.
Look, let's just finally speak a little bit about the politics that's happening, about Gaza, but elsewhere. There's been renewed efforts and continued efforts to try to broker some sort of ceasefire, but this all seems to be stalling. Do you have any hopes at this point?
We must have a hope. We hope that there is a ceasefire. What's going on, it's unbelievable. It's really a hell. There is no place in Gaza to escape. Now they are excusing, 1.8 million people in 30 square kilometers only. There is no prison. And all over the world, that, the space of a prison, 1 kilometer, and you have 60,000 people in that prison. 60,000 people now in every kilometer in the southern part of Gaza Strip. If you throw a stone, not a rocket, you will kill and injure people. Besides, that the whole humanitarian efforts is nearly collapsing because of the lack of food, the lack of medicine, the insecurity of the staff. So no one knows what to do. It's unbelievable what's going on. You cannot predict that you will be the next target, that you will be killed after, 5 minutes from now.
UNRWA spokesperson Adnan Abu-Hasna, we really appreciate your time on a difficult day. Thank you. Well, to some other news now. On a trip to Beirut, Europe's top diplomat has called for a de-escalation of tensions along the Lebanon-Israel border. Meeting government officials and visiting the border town of Naqara, Josep Borrell reiterated the EU's strong support for the Lebanese people. And staying with this, Israeli media reporting Josep Borrell's cancelled his visit to the country as part of his current regional tour, apparently after Israel's Foreign Minister Yisrael Katz refused to permit Borrell's trip and asked him to postpone until October once Borrell's finished his term in Brussels. Bowles openly criticised the Israeli government and proposed sanctions against 2 ministers during EU meetings. South Korea saying North Korea's fired several short-range ballistic missiles off its east coast in its first launch in more than 2 months. Seoul's Joint Chiefs of Staff saying its military is analysing the missile data and closely exchanging information with US and Japanese authorities while increasing surveillance and vigilance in preparation for possible further tests. In the US, southern states are under wind and flood alerts after Hurricane Francine made landfall in Louisiana, hitting New Orleans with heavy rain and strong gusts. The arrival of the storm had prompted authorities to issue evacuation orders for thousands of people. The National Hurricane Center saying Francine's accompanied by maximum winds of 120 kilometers per hour and issuing a warning for the entire Gulf Coast. Look at this historic moment as 2 of 4 SpaceX crew members completed the first ever spacewalk by private astronauts. A live webcast broadcasting the moment, billionaire Jarek Isaacman exited the vehicle, followed soon after by SpaceX engineer Sarah Gillis once he returned. The 4 civilian astronauts are part of the Polaris Dawn mission, which is seeing them travel through Earth's orbit on a 5-day mission. And in another feat of human achievement, an American ultra-endurance cyclist has beaten all records to become the fastest woman to cycle around the world. Alaskan Lael Wilcox began her journey in Chicago and spent more than 108 days in the saddle, crossing 4 continents and covering a distance of just north of 29,000 kilometers. Hot on her heels, though, is an Indian endurance cyclist who's currently 65 days into her own attempt to beat the record, so that victory might hang in the balance. Well, still to come here on W News, we get the latest from our London correspondent on a joint and high-value show of UK-US support in Kyiv.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers,
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
join me on the Rizkan Show for empowering conversation.
Welcome back. Now, an extra $1.5 billion has been pledged to Ukraine by the US and UK. In a rare joint visit to Kyiv by both countries' top diplomats, this comes as Ukraine's leadership is renewing their calls to be allowed to use longer-range missiles against targets further inside Russia. For more on this, I'm now joined from London by our correspondent there, Ollie Barrett. Ollie, good to see you. Look, this is being described as a sort of rare joint visit by the US and the UK. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, Rosanna, that is the case, and a large support package being announced by both the Americans and the British as part of this trip to see Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine, a package that's going to be spent, according to the British, on things like humanitarian, energy and what they call stabilisation needs. The American assistance will also go to the energy sector and things like demining as well. And what the British and the Americans are trying to do here is show that they are still on the same page about supporting Ukraine in the short term, but also over the longer term as well. And you mentioned those calls from the Ukrainians, while David Lammy, the UK Foreign Secretary, and Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State for the United States, were in Ukraine. Those calls for the ability to use long-range missiles to strike targets inside Russia. That was something that both men were asked about as well, and the Ukrainians keen to keep the pressure on in that regard, and both men hinting that those discussions are certainly underway. All of this comes ahead of a visit by Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, to Washington on Friday, and Antony Blinken was making it clear that he thought that that issue of long-range missiles and their use by the Ukrainians would be discussed between Keir Starmer and Joe Biden in Washington.
Indeed, it seems like the UK is really getting out there on a foreign policy front right now with all these overseas visits. I'm interested in that £1.5 billion figure that's been, well, just about up to that amount that's been committed to Ukraine, because it was almost split down the middle between the US and the UK, and they're not the same size economy. So that's a very big commitment from the UK.
Well, the UK and the US, as you say, announcing this package, I think because they wanted to show that they were, again, there together, announcing large support packages. But as you say, proportionally, they are rather different. And that does illustrate to a certain extent some of the concern among European allies of Ukraine that America has perhaps been a little bit slow recently in some of its support for the Ukrainians. They also have that concern about what happens at the upcoming presidential election in November and what that might mean for further Ukrainian support, particularly if Donald Trump were to win the White House back. And so there have been a lot of efforts by the UK and other European countries recently to try and find ways of making sure not just that the American support for the Ukrainians continues now, but that they can lock in some of it for the future as well. And this package, I think, illustrates part of that. But also, as you say, the fact that the UK support for the Ukrainians has been, in financial terms, the British would say, very significant indeed. The British have long tried to portray themselves as Ukraine's strongest ally, really, before the invasion by Russia and also after it. And perhaps this financial support package, in terms of the scale of it, privately British diplomats might suggest goes some further way to illustrating that support from the British compared to some other countries.
Now, with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, as you said, they're heading to Washington, D.C. You think the Ukrainian wish to use long-range missiles into Russia might be on the agenda. What else might he be seeking to achieve in D.C.?
Yeah, that is going to be on the agenda. We don't necessarily think there's going to be any great announcement that comes out of it on Friday after they've held talks, but we do think that the British have effectively already decided that this is what they want to do. And if there is broad agreement on that topic between Joe Biden and Keir Starmer, we'd then expect some further diplomacy behind the scenes. Keir Starmer heads to Italy, for example, later over the weekend and into Monday for talks with the Italian Prime Minister on that issue. There would be further diplomacy with European allies on that issue of the use of longer range missiles by Ukraine inside Russia, but lots more on the agenda besides that as well, particularly the Middle East, and both the British and the Americans calling for further progress towards some kind of sustainable ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. That will be key among the topics that are going to be discussed as well. Lots more to the bilateral relationship between the Americans and the UK at the moment. Keir Starmer also wanting to show that as a new UK Prime Minister, he is held in high esteem in Washington. But Ukraine, those long-range missiles and the Middle East, I think will certainly top the agenda.
We'll have to wait and see. Ollie Barrett for us in London there. Thank you. We will be right back after this short break.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers,
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Welcome back. Now, as the dust settles from Tuesday night's presidential debate stateside, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are back out on the campaign trail with less than 8 weeks to go until polling day. For more on this, I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by our correspondent there, Caroline Malone. Caroline, we've now got the figures in. Some 67 million people watched that Harris-Trump debate. That blows the previous Biden matchup out the water. Now that the dust settles, what sort of conclusions have been drawn in general from the public, from media pundits? Who came out stronger?
Well, a lot of pundits, a lot of politicians and a lot of people who've been polled seem to think that it was Kamala Harris that seemed to do the best in that debate on Tuesday night. But actually, when you drill down to some of the detail of the debate, a lot of viewers also saying that Trump did better on some subjects, one of which is the economy, which is vitally important and really resonates with voters. You know, Trump himself came out after the debate and declared himself the winner. He said that, you know, he did well despite the fact he felt he was having to debate against three people. He was referencing there how the ABC moderators actually challenged him quite a lot on the facts that he brought to the stage. Some could argue that he needed to be challenged on those facts more than Harris, but it did seem that they potentially gave him a harder time than Harris. You know, in this debate, we had those large viewing numbers, as you've described there, 10 million more than the Biden-Trump debate. And we know, of course, how pivotal that was with this election campaign, with Biden now not running to be president again. However, if we look back in history to, let's say, 2016, there were more than 80 million people watching the debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. That was, of course, an election debate that was won by Clinton, but then Donald Trump went on to win the actual election itself. So certainly these debates are important. The viewer shows engagement on a voter level to people watching and looking to see which candidate they'll vote for. But it's certainly not decisive when it comes to deciding who will eventually win the White House again.
So what are the polls saying, Caroline? You know, with less than 2 months to go, are they changing at all?
We are seeing some trends in the polls, particularly from Harris supporters who've now brought her up to be neck and neck to Trump, both on a nationwide level, where we're seeing them almost at equal percentage points, but also more critically in swing states. Swing states are so vital because ultimately voters decide on a state level who they're going to vote for, which candidate they choose, and then that state gets the electoral votes that then go towards the eventual candidate becoming president. The swing states that are really critical, according to a lot of political strategists for Harris, include Wisconsin, they include Pennsylvania, they include Michigan. She's also now campaigning in North Carolina on Thursday. That's another swing state that's vitally important. And Trump is also campaigning in states such as Nevada. All of those states are within 1 to 3 percentage points. Harris is definitely gaining, maybe ahead a little bit in some of the central states in the US, but all within a margin of error. So really at this point, it could go either way for any of those swing states. What is also very important when it comes to the data and the numbers is the amount of funding that these campaigns are gaining. Harris, thus far, has got about $500 million. That's a huge much more than the Trump campaign. That is vitally important to help her reach voters, to work on a grassroots level, to convince voters not just to vote for her, but to make sure they actually come out on voting day and put their ballot towards Harris. So that is a huge advantage for Democrats and something that could potentially make a difference when it comes to these vital swing states.
There's a lot of discussion as well about whether we might see another debate in the few weeks that we've got left. In whose interests would that be?
Well, right off the back of the debate, it was the Harris campaign that came out and said they were ready for a second debate. They wanted to move forward with this idea that there should be a second debate before the election. There's only now, 8 weeks to go, though, till the election. So it's really getting to the final stages of the election and the campaigning. In fact, a number of states already have mail-in ballots going out to their voters. So people are actually already potentially deciding who they're going to vote for in a matter of days or weeks. Trump seems to be a little bit more back and forth on whether he would agree to a second debate. It took the two different campaigns a long time to get to the point where they even decided on the first debate. They were arguing mainly over the detail of whether microphones should be muted or not. The agreement ended up in Trump's favour. His aides wanted to make sure the microphone stayed muted. Interestingly, though, on Tuesday night, we did hear a bit of back and forth among those candidates, but it sounded like it was more in the background of the microphones. But that potentially, could have helped Trump in his favour and maybe one of the sticking points if they decide on a second debate.
I mean, casting our minds forward a little now, post-election, January 6th, always a key date, and now particularly so because of what happened January 6th previously. And it's the first change of administration since 2021. So are there going to be changes? What steps are being spoken about?
There absolutely are changes. And in fact, that date has just been designated as a national special security event. And what that means is that federal agencies and security agencies are able to put forward a really strong security plan and funding to make sure that essentially everyone stays safe on that event, given, you know, the anniversary of what's happened in the United States, in Washington, D.C., with the Capitol riots in 2021. Now, when it comes to funding, that's decided on a federal level and also through different agencies and security agencies, one of which is the Capitol Police here in Washington, D.C. Since 2021, they've greatly increased their hiring. So they now have more officers available, so potentially more boots on the ground, as it were, to help protect, especially around Congress, especially around Capitol Hill, where a lot of the action will be happening that day. And when you look at recent events in Washington, D.C., you can see a level of security here that we haven't seen potentially in previous years. One example is when Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel was here speaking to Congress. Out on the streets, there were large protests. But at those protests, there was a very strong fencing that was put around Capitol Hill. There was Capitol Police very visible at every corner on every street to really control the crowds. And I think we can expect that level of security again when it comes to the events of January of next year, when they're going to be carrying out some, vital events inside Congress, essentially officiating what ends up being the election results.
Caroline Malone in Washington, D.C. Thank you. Some business news now. Boeing is under new pressure with voting underway by around 30,000 West Coast factory workers on a possible strike that could start Friday. This just the latest in mounting pressures facing the US plane maker, grappling with a $60 billion debt burden and production delays, in addition to safety concerns about the 737 MAX model. Shares down 36% this year, and a major strike would pose a big challenge for new CEO Kelly Ortberg just a month into the role. US inflation falls to the lowest in 3 years, raising hopes the country's central bank will cut interest rates next week. Given the state of voters' finances, this will likely form a key pillar of debate in the run-up to the presidential election. Inflation peaked in 2022 but has been cooling for the past few months, providing relief to American consumers. Some developments in the ongoing central bank crisis in Libya, where a factional struggle for control over the bank has meant financial chaos for many. According to an Arabiya correspondent, talks between the UN and various rival political leaders and representatives have resumed after a week of stalling. The goal is to agree principles that will eventually lead to the appointment of the central bank governor and a board of directors. Let's get a reminder of our top stories. At least 18 people have been killed following an Israeli strike on a school in a Gaza refugee camp. The US and UK have pledged nearly $1.5 billion in additional funding to Ukraine in a joint visit to Kyiv. And Capitol Hill is to receive increased security on January 6 when members of US Congress certify electoral votes for the 2024 presidential election. Well, that is all we have time for. Up next is Hadley Gamble interviewing Tim Lindeking, the US envoy to Yemen. And at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, join Tom Burgess-Watson for Global News Today, a deep dive into what US foreign policy could look like post-election and what this means for Gaza.